Close your eyes and imagine this. It's Father's Day weekend, June 1969. You're 6 years old. Your parents have taken you camping in one of the most beautiful places in America, the Great Smoky Mountains. The air smells like pine. Birds echo through the trees. Families are cooking breakfast. Children are laughing. Nothing feels dangerous. Nothing feels unusual. Then someone suggests a game. Hide and seek. The perfect game for a forest. You laugh, take off running, and disappear behind the trees. Your father smiles. He knows exactly what's about to happen. You'll jump out, everyone will laugh, the game will be over. Except you never come back. Your father waits 30 seconds, then a minute. He calls your name. Nothing. He searches behind every tree nearby. Nothing. Within minutes, other campers begin helping. Then park rangers, then trained search and rescue teams. Within hours, hundreds of people are combing the mountains. By the next morning, the search has become one of the largest in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains. Helicopters circle overhead, tracking dogs scour the trails, military personnel join the operation. Thousands of acres are searched. Not a single trace is found. No footprints, no torn clothing, no blood, no body, no explanation. Dennis Martin had vanished. Here's what makes the story so unsettling. Dennis wasn't alone. He didn't disappear in the middle of the night. He wasn't hiking miles from civilization. He vanished in broad daylight, surrounded by people, in less than a minute. And if this only had happened once, it would already be one of the strangest missing person cases in American history. But it didn't, because over the next several decades, dozens of remarkably similar disappearances would be reported across North American wilderness. Children, experienced hikers, hunters, backpackers, park rangers, people who knew these forests better than almost anyone. Some would eventually be found, many wouldn't, and those cases would become known by a single name: Missing 411. America's national parks are often described as the country's greatest treasure. More than 400 protected sites covering over 85 million acres, towering mountains, ancient forests, endless deserts. Places where millions of people escape the noise of everyday life. Every year, hundreds of millions of visitors hike these trails, camp beneath these stars, and return home with stories they'll tell for the rest of their lives. For almost everyone, that's exactly how the story ends, but not for everyone, because every year people disappear. Most are found within hours, others within days. Some are rescued just in time, and then there are the cases that refuse to end. The ones where the search teams go home, the helicopters stop flying, the missing person posters begin to fade, but the questions never do. When you hear the phrase of missing 411, you might think it's the name of a government program. It isn't. You might think it's an FBI investigation. It's not. So, where did the name come from? And why has it become one of the most debated topics in the world of unsolved mysteries? That's where our investigation really begins. For most people, the wilderness represents freedom, a place to disconnect, to leave behind busy highways, phone calls, emails, and deadlines. Millions of Americans visit national parks every year. Some come to climb mountains, others to fish, camp, photograph wildlife, or simply experience places that have remained almost untouched for centuries. These parks are some of the safest public lands in the country. Park rangers patrol them every day. Search and rescue teams train year round. Trails are marked. Maps are available almost everywhere. Most visitors never experience anything more dangerous than a twisted ankle or an unexpected rainstorm, which makes the stories you've heard feel almost impossible. If I told you someone disappeared in the middle of a war, you'd probably understand. If I told you someone disappeared in the middle of the ocean, that would make sense too. But disappearing from one of the most visited national parks on Earth during daylight, surrounded by people, that's harder to explain. And that's exactly why these cases continue to fascinate millions of people. For decades, these disappearances were treated as separate tragedies. A child missing in Tennessee, a hunter vanishing in Montana, a backpacker gone in California. Different people, different forests, different years. No obvious connection. Until one retired police officer began asking a simple question: what if they weren't completely unrelated? His name was David Paulides. Before becoming an author, Paulides spent years in law enforcement. During his research, he became interested in unusual disappearances occurring on public lands. He filed public records requests, collected newspaper archives, read search reports, interviewed investigators, studied missing person files. Over time, he believed he noticed something, not proof, not a conspiracy, a pattern. This is where missing 411 becomes controversial, because the moment someone says they found a pattern, another person asks, did they really? And that's a fair question. Patterns can be meaningful, but humans are also incredibly good at seeing patterns, even when none exist. And that's why it's important we separate facts from interpretation. Paulides eventually published his findings under a title that would become famous: Missing 411. The name itself doesn't refer to an emergency code or a classified government project. It's simply the title of his book series documenting unusual disappearances. Supporters believe the cases reveal similarities that deserve more attention. Critics argue that many of those similarities are subjective, and that focusing only on unusual cases can create the impression of a pattern where none exists. Both sides agree on one thing: the disappearances themselves are real. As I read through these investigations, one thing became impossible to ignore. Not the theories, not the speculation, the families. Mothers who never stopped looking, fathers who retraced the same trails year after year, brothers, sisters, children who grew up without answers. Before the internet debated these cases, they were simply families waiting for someone to come home. And that's why this documentary isn't about proving monsters exist or proving they don't. It's not about proving a conspiracy, it's about following the evidence. Wherever it leads, sometimes it gives us even bigger questions. And before we can understand why these disappearances remain so mysterious, we need to understand something almost nobody talks about: search and rescue. Because if you think finding one person in the woods is easy, you're about to discover it's one of the hardest jobs on earth. When someone is reported missing in the wilderness, the clock starts immediately because in search and rescue, time is everything. The first few hours are often called the golden hours, not because finding someone is easy, but because the chances of success are highest before weather changes, before daylight fades, and before valuable clues begin to disappear. The moment a report comes in, every decision matters. Where was the missing person last seen? What were they wearing? Were they carrying food, water, a map? Were they injured? Did they have experience in the outdoors? Every answer helps determine one thing: where do we start looking? This is one of the most important concepts in every missing person investigation. It's called the last known point, or the LKP. It's exactly what it sounds like: the last place investigators know with reasonable confidence the missing person was last seen. Every search begins there, not because rescuers assume the person is still nearby, but because it's the only place they know for certain. Everything after that is an educated guess. From the last known point, the search begins to expand. Search managers divide the landscape into sectors. Each team receives a specific area. Their job isn't just to look, it's to eliminate possibilities. Every trail walked, every ravine checked, every creek searched reduces the area where the missing person could still be. In theory, it's a simple system. In reality, it's anything but. Imagine standing in a forest. Now imagine just taking 20 steps off the trail. Turn around. The path you just left has disappeared. The trees all look the same. The terrain begins changing. Visibility shrinks to only a few feet. From a helicopter, you may as well be invisible. People often imagine forests as open spaces. They aren't. They're walls. Walls made of leaves, branches, rocks, and shadows. Here's something that surprised me while researching this documentary. Search teams have found missing people astonishingly close to trails, sometimes within a few dozen yards. In some cases, they were close enough that hikers unknowingly walked past them. That doesn't mean rescuers were careless. It means nature is incredibly good at hiding people. Even thermal cameras, often portrayed as miracle technology, have limits. Thick vegetation blocks heat. Warm rocks can create false readings. Heavy rain, fog, and terrain all reduce effectiveness. Technology helps, but it doesn't eliminate the challenge. Then there are dogs. Perhaps no part of Missing 411 has generated more discussion than scent tracking dogs. Supporters often point to cases where dogs appeared to lose a scent unexpectedly. At first, that sounds impossible until you understand how scent actually works. A human scent isn't a line painted on the ground. It's a constantly changing cloud of microscopic particles. Wind carries it, rain washes it away, streams interrupt it, heat lifts it, cold traps it. A rocky hillside may hold almost no scent at all. A dense forest may hold it for hours. To an experienced handler, a dog stopping isn't necessarily mysterious. It's information. Information that must be interpreted, carefully. This is why I wanted to spend time to explain search and rescue, because without understanding how difficult these searches really are, it's easy to assume every unexplained disappearance must have an extraordinary explanation. Sometimes, the ordinary explanation is simply far more complicated than we realize. But there are still cases where even experienced investigators admitted they couldn't explain what happened. And that's where our story returns to Dennis Martin. Because once you understand how search works, you begin to realize just how extraordinary his disappearance really was. It's easy to forget that before Dennis Martin became one of America's most famous missing children, he was simply a little boy on vacation, 6 years old, full of energy, curious about everything. According to those who knew him, Dennis loved the outdoors. He wasn't afraid of the woods. To him, the mountains weren't dangerous, they were a playground. His family had driven from Tennessee to spend Father's Day weekend camping at Spence Field, a remote but popular backcountry area near the Tennessee North Carolina border. The trip was supposed to create memories. Instead, it became one of the greatest mysteries in national park history. Before we continue, look at where this happened. Today, millions of people visit the Great Smoky Mountains every year. It's the most visited national park in the United States, even in 1969. This wasn't some forgotten wilderness no one ever entered. There were campers nearby, families, hikers, people everywhere, which makes what happened next even harder to understand. That afternoon, Dennis and several other children decided to play hide and seek. The rules were simple. Some children would circle around through the woods, others would hide. Dennis chose a different direction. His father watched him disappear behind a group of trees. There was nothing unusual about it. Children disappear behind trees every few seconds. The expectation was that Dennis would jump out laughing at any moment. 30 seconds passed, then 60. Still nothing. His father smiled, then called out, "Dennis." No answer. He walked towards the trees. Nothing. He searched farther. Still nothing. The smile disappeared. At first, no one panicked. Children wander. That's what children do. But every minute that passed made less sense than the one before. Dennis knew the area around camp. He wasn't the kind of child to intentionally hide for long. Within minutes, everyone nearby had joined the search: parents, campers, hikers. They called his name until their voices echoed through the mountains. Nothing answered. Imagine being his father. Every minute feels like an hour. You start replaying everything. Did I look behind that tree? Did he go back towards camp? Did someone see him? You tell yourself, he has to be close, because the alternative is unthinkable. As daylight faded, the search expanded rapidly. Park rangers arrived, then sheriff's deputies, volunteers, search and rescue personnel. Within hours, what began as a father looking for his son had become a coordinated rescue operation. By the following morning, the search had grown into one of the largest ever conducted inside the Great Smoky Mountains. Hundreds of volunteers joined. Military personnel assisted. Search dogs followed every possible trail. Helicopters searched from above, every ravine, every stream, every cliff. Every campsite was examined. Investigators believed they would find Dennis quickly. After all, how far could a 6-year-old possibly travel? Hour after hour, the search area grew. Then another day passed. Then another. No footprints, no clothing, no backpack, no signs of struggle, nothing. The deeper searchers looked, the more impossible the disappearance began to feel. The terrain certainly complicated the search. Dense rhododendron can form walls so thick that visibility drops to almost nothing. Steep ravines disappear beneath layers of vegetation. Loose rocks, hidden creeks, sharp drop offs. Nature seems determined to keep its secrets. But then something happened. A report. One witness, one statement. A statement that would become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. The next part is important because depending on where you read about this case, the story changes. Some people present this witness as undeniable proof of an abduction. Others believe the account was unreliable or impossible to verify. So here's what we know and what we don't. By the second day, hope was beginning to fade. Search teams had already covered miles of difficult terrain. Every hour that passed made survival less likely. Then, investigators received a report. A family who had been hiking in another area of the park claimed they had seen something unusual around the time Dennis disappeared. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a struggle. It was a man walking through the woods, carrying something over his shoulder. Over the years, the details of this report have been repeated in books, documentaries, podcasts, and online discussions. But depending on the source, the description changes. Some versions describe the man as dirty, unkempt, and moving quickly through the forest. Others simply describe an unfamiliar adult carrying what appeared to be a child. Some later retellings include additional details that are not documented in official records. Because of these differences, it's difficult to know exactly what was observed. What is clear is that investigators were made aware of the report. What remains unclear is whether it had anything to do with Dennis Martin. This is something you'll notice throughout this documentary. As years pass, stories grow, details get added. People remember events differently. That's why it's important to separate what was documented from what was repeated later. The witness account is interesting. It deserved to be investigated, but has never been confirmed as evidence that Dennis was abducted. As investigators continue searching, another frustrating reality became clear. There was almost nothing else to work with. No confirmed footprints leading away from camp, no damaged vegetation pointing towards a specific route, no blood, no clothing, no signs of an animal attack, no evidence of foul play, just absence. For investigators, absence can be one of the hardest things to explain. Evidence tells a story, but when evidence doesn't exist, every possibility remains open. The official search lasted for days. Volunteers came from the surrounding communities. Military personnel assisted. Experienced outdoorsmen combed terrain they knew well. Thousands of acres were searched. Eventually, the operation began winding down, not because anyone wanted to stop, but because every realistic lead had been exhausted. Dennis Martin was never found. More than a half a century later, his disappearance remains officially unsolved. When people talk about missing 411, this is almost always the first case they mention. Not because it's the strangest, but because it raises a question that's surprisingly difficult to answer. How can a child disappear when in sight of family during daylight in an area that was almost immediately flooded with searchers and leave behind so little evidence? No one has been able to answer that with certainty. For many people, Dennis Martin became more than a missing person case. He became the beginning of a larger question. Were there other disappearances that shared similar circumstances? David Paulides believed there were. His critics argued the similarities were overstated. To find out, we have to leave the Smoky Mountains and travel west to another national park, another ordinary day, another person who seemed to vanish without anyone seeing how. If Dennis Martin had been the only unexplained disappearance, there would be no missing 411. His case would simply be remembered as one more heartbreaking mystery. But over the years, more names appeared. Different forests, different decades, different victims. Some were children, others were experienced hikers. Some disappeared within sight of other people, others vanished alone. Each case was unique, and yet each one left behind the same thing: questions. 7 years after Dennis Martin disappeared, another mystery unfolded in the very same national park. 16-year-old Trini Gibson arrived with classmates for what should have been an ordinary school field trip. The destination? Clingman's Dome, today known as Kauai, one of the most visited overlooks in the Smokies. The trail is short, paved, busy. Hardly the kind of place where someone simply vanishes. Witnesses later reported seeing Trini walking with the group. She wasn't alone, she wasn't lost, she wasn't behaving strangely. Then, somewhere along that trail, she disappeared. Teachers believed she had fallen behind. Classmates searched the trail. Park rangers joined the effort. Helicopters flew overhead. Search dogs combed the surrounding forest. Days became weeks, weeks became months. No confirmed trace of Trini Gibson has ever been found. Two disappearances, same national park, 7 years apart. That's one of the observations that caused David Paulides to start asking bigger questions. But if you think that's unusual, wait until you hear what happened in Colorado. Jared Atadero loved exploring. He was 3 years old enough to run ahead, young enough to believe every trail led to another adventure. While hiking with adults on Colorado's Big South Trail, Jared became fascinated by butterflies. Witnesses remembered him moving farther up the trail, just ahead, only a few seconds, only a short distance. Then he was gone. The search began immediately. Volunteers, helicopters, dogs, mounted teams. Thousands of acres were searched. Days passed. Nothing. For nearly 4 years, the mountains kept their secret. Then, in 2003, hikers discovered scattered remains later identified as Jared's. Investigators concluded the remains had been exposed to the elements and scavenging animals over time. But because no one witnessed what happened after he disappeared, the complete sequence of events has never been reconstructed with certainty. For his family, many questions remain. Notice something? These cases don't all end in the same way. Some people are never found, others are found months or years later. Sometimes investigators can explain most of what happened, sometimes they can't. And that's exactly why it's dangerous to force every case into the same explanation. Unlike the cases we've already covered, Dior Kunz Jr. disappearance became something else entirely, a criminal investigation, a 2-year-old boy, a family camping trip, 4 adults, one small campground, according to the family's account. Everyone believed someone else was watching Dior. When they looked again, he was gone. Hundreds of searchers descended on the area. Dogs, helicopters, divers, drones, nothing. Over time, investigators publicly stated they no longer believed Dior had simply wandered away. No one has ever been charged. The case remains officially unsolved. 3 children, one teenager, 4 disappearances, different decades, different circumstances, different investigations, and yet every one of them asks the same question: what happened during the moments no one was watching? Here's where the investigation changes, because now that we've looked at the cases, it's time to examine the claim that made Missing 411 famous. Do these disappearances actually share unusual patterns, or are we simply connecting dots that were never connected in the first place? Let's look at the evidence. At this point, it's easy to see why Missing 411 became so popular. Not because every disappearance is identical, they're not. Not because every victim vanished under impossible circumstances, they didn't. It's because when enough strange cases are placed next to each other, certain similarities begin to stand out. Some people see coincidence, others see a pattern. So, let's examine those patterns ourselves. One observation frequently discussed by Missing 411 supporters is water. Many missing person cases occur near rivers, creeks, lakes, or swamps. At first, that sounds unusual until you remember something. People naturally spend time near water. Campgrounds are often built beside rivers. Trails frequently follow streams. Hikers stop at lakes. Fishermen head towards creeks. Water attracts people, which means it also became a common location for accidents. Investigators often began searching waterways almost immediately, not because water is mysterious, but because it's statistically one of the most dangerous places in the wilderness. Another frequently discussed pattern is sudden weather. Supporters point to cases where storms appeared shortly after someone disappeared, making searches dramatically more difficult. Again, this sounds unusual until you understand mountain weather. Conditions can change astonishingly fast, especially in high elevations. Fog reduces visibilities, rain washes away footprints, wind scatters scent, snow buries evidence. Search teams don't fear storms because they're mysterious. They fear them because every minute of bad weather erases another piece of the investigation. Perhaps no pattern has generated more debate than tracking dogs. Supporters often ask, how can trained bloodhounds suddenly lose someone? It's a fair question. The answer is complicated. Dogs don't follow people, they follow scent, and scent behaves more like smoke than footprints. Wind moves it, water breaks it apart, heat lifts it, cold traps it, time weakens it. A dog stopping doesn't necessarily mean the trail ends. It may simply mean the scent has changed. One thing I noticed while researching is that people often misunderstand what search dogs actually do. They're not magic, they're incredibly skilled, but even the best dog in the world can't track scent that no longer exists. This may be the most controversial observation of all. There have been cases where remains were later discovered in areas that had already been searched. At first, that seems impossible. How could hundreds of trained rescuers miss someone? The answer is they sometimes do. Search and rescue professionals have documented instances where thick vegetation, steep terrain, seasonal changes, or scavenging animals made it possible for remains to go unnoticed during earlier searches. That doesn't mean every such discovery has a simple explanation, but it does remind us that even the best search isn't perfect. Some missing 411 cases involve young children found miles from where they disappeared, sometimes at surprisingly high elevations. Supporters argue these distances are difficult to explain. Search experts caution that estimating exactly how a child moved through rugged terrain is often impossible after the fact. Children can behave unpredictably when frightened. They don't always follow trails. They may continue walking long after adults expect them to stop. Every case is different, which is exactly why these sweeping conclusions are so difficult. So, after looking at all these patterns, what have we actually learned? Some observations are real, others may be influenced by where people hike, how searches work, and in which cases receive the most attention. That's why patterns alone don't solve a mystery, evidence does. And that's where our investigation becomes even more controversial. Because once people started noticing these similarities, they began asking a different question. If nature doesn't explain every disappearance, what does? The answers range from completely reasonable to absolutely extraordinary. After decades of disappearances, people began searching for something bigger, not another missing person, an explanation. Why did some people vanish without a trace? Why did some searches fail despite enormous resources? Why did some cases seem so unusual? No single answer has ever explained every disappearance, but over the years, several competing theories have emerged, some supported by evidence, others remain speculation. Let's examine them one by one. The simplest explanation is also the least exciting: nature. People underestimate the wilderness every year. Experienced hikers become disoriented, small injuries become life threatening, weather changes, darkness falls, hypothermia sets in. One wrong turn can become impossible to undo. Search and rescue professionals consistently point towards terrain, weather, exhaustion, and human decision making as major reasons why people become lost. Sometimes the wilderness alone is enough. If every missing 411 case were simply someone getting lost, this documentary probably wouldn't exist. Nature explains a lot, maybe even most, but not necessarily all, which brings us to another possibility. America's national parks are enormous. Many are larger than entire cities. Some contain hundreds of miles of isolated roads and backcountry trails. Although uncommon, violent crimes, including assaults and homicides, have occurred in wilderness areas. That means some disappearances could involve another person rather than the environment. Investigators have solved cases where missing hikers were victims of crimes, but those investigations usually produced evidence, witnesses, DNA, vehicles, electronic records. Many missing 411 cases do not. Could predators explain some disappearances? Sometimes. Mountain lions are powerful ambush hunters. Black bears, while usually avoiding people, have been responsible for rare fatal attacks. Other scavengers can scatter remains after death. Wildlife experts caution, however, that animal attacks often leave physical evidence tracks, blood, signs of struggle. That evidence isn't always present in the cases most often discussed as missing 411. One mistake people make is assuming that every unexplained disappearance must have one explanation. Real life rarely works that way. Different cases can completely have different causes. Perhaps the most underestimated factor is psychology. Fear changes the brain, exhaustion changes judgment, hyperthermia affects memory, dehydration causes confusion. People begin making decisions that seem irrational to someone reading a case file years later, leaving a trail, removing clothing, walking uphill instead of downhill, ignoring nearby shelter. These behaviors have all been documented in survival situations. Sometimes, the strangest actions have the most ordinary explanations. Finally, we have arrived at the theory that brought millions of people to missing 411, the paranormal. Depending on who you ask, the explanations vary dramatically. Some point to folklore, stories passed down through generations, warning people not to follow strange voices or lights in the woods. Others speculate about unknown creatures or hidden dimensions, or ideas popularized in online discussions. These theories are compelling because they attempt to explain what appears to be unexplainable. But it's important to separate possibility from evidence. At this time, there is no verified evidence demonstrating that paranormal forces are responsible for missing 411 disappearances. That doesn't stop people from asking questions, but questions are not proof. And I think that's an important distinction. A mystery doesn't automatically become supernatural just because we don't have an answer. Sometimes, I don't know is the most honest answer you can give. After months of research, I came to one conclusion. Missing 411 isn't one mystery, it's dozens, maybe hundreds. Some almost certainly have ordinary explanations. Some may involve crime, some may never be solved. Trying to force every case into a single theory may actually prevent us from understanding what really happened. But there is one question that still refuses to go away. If the evidence doesn't support one explanation, why has missing 411 captured the imagination of millions of people? To answer that, we have to stop looking at the forest and start looking at ourselves. When someone disappears, time stops. Not for the world keeps moving. People go to work, children grow up, the season changes. National parks welcome millions of new visitors. Life continues. But for one family, everything changes. Every birthday becomes a reminder. Every holiday feels incomplete. Every phone call carries a tiny piece of hope. Maybe this time someone knows something. Maybe this time there will finally be an answer. When a search officially ends, it doesn't end for everyone. Search teams eventually go home, helicopters return to base, roadblocks disappear, the command center comes down, but families keep searching. Some return to the same trails every year. Others organize volunteer searches. Some spend decades following every new lead, no matter how unlikely, because hope doesn't follow official timelines. I think that's something the internet sometimes forgets. It's easy to debate theories, it's easy to argue about missing 411, it's easy to watch a documentary, close YouTube, and move on. But for families, this isn't entertainment. This isn't a rabbit hole. This is someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's husband, someone's mother. Before these people became mysteries, they were loved. And I think it's important we never lose sight of that. There's another reason these stories stay with us. They challenge something we take for granted: control. We live in a world of GPS, satellite imagery, cell phones, emergency beacons, drones, artificial intelligence. We assume if someone disappears, we'll find them. Most of the time we do, but not always. And those exceptions remind us technology has limits. Nature still writes its own rules. One thing became clear while researching this documentary: missing 411 isn't famous because someone proved a conspiracy. It's famous because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Our brains are built to solve a puzzle. When pieces are missing, we keep searching, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations. Maybe that's why people disagree so strongly about these cases. Some believe every mystery has a logical explanation. Others believe some questions point towards something we don't yet understand. Most people fall somewhere in between, looking for answers, trying to make sense of incomplete evidence. And that's okay, because admitting we don't know isn't weakness, it's honesty. At the beginning of this documentary, I asked you to imagine standing alone in the forest. Now, I want you to imagine something else. Imagine being the last person to see someone alive. You replay that moment over and over. Could I have stopped them? Should I have looked sooner? Did I miss something? Those questions don't disappear. Neither does the guilt. For many families, that's the heaviest burden of all: not knowing. Perhaps that's why these disappearances continue to fascinate us. Not because they're supernatural, not because they're impossible, but because they remind us that some chapters remain unfinished, some questions remain unanswered, and some families are still waiting. When this documentary began, I asked you to imagine standing alone deep inside one of America's national parks. The birds were singing, the wind moved gently through the trees. Everything felt peaceful, safe. Now, after everything you've seen, that same forest probably feels different. Not because the forest changed, because you did. For thousands of years, people have entered forests searching for something: food, adventures, solitude, freedom. Some enter looking for answers, some never came home. Long before there were national parks, long before roads, long before maps, people disappeared here. The wilderness has always been beautiful and has always been indifferent. I think that's the biggest lesson I learned while making this documentary. The forest doesn't hate us, it isn't hunting us, it doesn't need to. Nature doesn't make decisions, it doesn't choose victims, it simply exists, completely indifferent to whether we're prepared or not. One unexpected storm, one twisted ankle, one wrong turn, one moment of panic. Sometimes that's all it takes. The wilderness doesn't care how experienced you are. It doesn't care how many times you've hiked the trail before. The same mountain that gives one family the greatest weekend of their lives can become another family's greatest tragedy. If you've made it this far, I want to leave you with one final thought. Throughout this documentary, we've talked about theories, we've talked about mysteries, we've talked about disappearances. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the question isn't what happened. Maybe the better question is, what can we learn? Because every one of these cases, whether it ended in tragedy or it remains unsolved, teaches us something about nature, about search and rescue, about grief, about hope, and about how quickly an ordinary day can become extraordinary. Somewhere right now, a search is underway. A helicopter is flying low over the trees. A bloodhound is following a faded scent. A volunteer is calling someone's name into the woods. A family is staring at a phone, waiting for it to ring. Most of those stories will have happy endings. Some won't. And a few will become the next mystery people talk about years from now. Not because they're supernatural, not because they're impossible, but because sometimes life doesn't give us every answer. If there's one thing I hope you take away from tonight, it's this: respect the wilderness, not because of ghost stories, not because of legends, not because of internet theories. Respect it because it's one of the few places left on Earth where nature is still completely in charge. Maybe that's why these stories never leave us. Not because they prove something extraordinary, but because they remind us that despite everything we've built, despite satellites, GPS, search helicopters, thermal cameras, and every advancement we've made, there are still places where the world refuses to give us easy answers. And perhaps that's exactly why we'll never stop searching. Thank you for watching. If this documentary made you think, consider subscribing to Dead Hour HQ. Every week we explore the stories history, crime, and the unexplained still can't fully answer. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.